In the year 2050 of the Third Age, King Earnur of Gondor rode to Minas Morgul with a small company of knights to answer the Witch King's challenge. He was never seen again, and he left behind no heir, leaving Gondor in yet another succession crisis. But instead of a new king being selected, it was decided that Gondor would be handed over to the rule of the Stewards, and they would rule Gondor for almost 1,000 years, until the ascendance of Aragorn following the War of the Ring. So the question is, why didn't Gondor choose a new king? Okay, so a little bit of background. In 2043, Prince Eärnur ascends to the throne of Gondor, becoming its 33rd king. On the year of his coronation, he receives a message from the Witch King in Minas Morgul, which had been taken 41 years earlier by the Nazgul. The message basically calls him a coward and challenges him to single combat, saying that when Eärnur had led the invasion of Angmar in 1975, he had fled from the Witch King. This isn't exactly true. Eärnur was not afraid of the Witch King and would have withstood him, but his horse bolted, making the prince seem like a coward. This hit Eärnur where it hurt. He was a temperamental man, a warrior first and a king second. Fighting was his favourite thing to do, to the point of where he hadn't even taken a wife and fathered a child. He was not a wise man, but thankfully he was restrained by his steward, Mardul Voronway of the House of Hurin. Unfortunately, 7 years later, the Witch King issued a second challenge, and this time, Eärnur could not be restrained. He left his crown behind, rode to Minas Morgul, and was never seen again. Although he was not officially declared dead at the time, it was obvious to all that he would not return. So, as was tradition when the king was away, the steward, Mardul Voronway, became regent. But this time, the king was not returning, and he didn't have a direct heir. This complicated things, and what ended up happening was that Mardul became the first ruling steward of Gondor, and when he died in 2080, his son, Eredan, would become second ruling steward, and this would continue all the way up until Denethor II, who ruled during the War of the Ring. So, why the stewards? Why didn't the Gondorians elect a new king? Or why didn't the stewards simply elevate themselves to the position of king? After all, as proven many times throughout Middle-earth's history, kings were often beacons of hope that could lift the spirits of the people and inspire them to greater things. So why wait, and instead make a king today? The answer, as per usual, is that it was not that simple. What many people falsely believe is that when Eärnur died, the line of Anarion died with him, and thus Gondor had no choice but to accept the stewards. But the line of Anarion didn't die out. For one, it continued in Arnor, but I'll get to that later. There were still descendants of Anarion in Gondor, so presumably one of these men could have been chosen to become the new king of Gondor. Except, there were some major problems, and to understand these problems, we have to understand a few key moments in Gondor's history. The first is the Kin Strife, a Gondorian civil war from 1432 to 1447 between King Eldacar and Castamir the Usurper. I won't go into too much detail because it's not important, but basically one of the major reasons for the war was because many Gondorians believed Eldacar to be illegitimate thanks to being half Northman. In the end, Eldacar was the victor, but the war did major damage to Gondor, and especially to the House of Anarion itself. As they had a large personal stake in the war, many members of the House of Anarion perished, or then fled to Umbar where Castamir's sons managed to seize power. That was not the end of it though. Over the next few centuries, the House of Anarion would continue to weaken, not just to the Great Plague or constant wars, but also directly thanks to the Kin Strife. The kings became wary of their close relatives, not wishing to become the next Eldacar, and as a result, family members on whom suspicion had fallen upon would often renounce their lineage and take wives of non-Númenórean blood to effectively disqualify their descendants. Some who felt even more threatened, or were perhaps even guilty, took the even more drastic measure of fleeing to Umbar and joining up with the rebels. Due to the aforementioned actions, the line of Anarion would continue to hemorrhage legitimate members, meaning that the direct kinsmen of the kings became fewer and fewer. This brings us to the death of King Onderher at the disaster of the Morannon. This battle would see the death of the king and his two sons, Artemir and Faramir. The latter was the spare and was not supposed to be at the battle, but he disguised himself and got killed like an idiot. This left Gondor in a succession crisis, as Onderher apparently did not have any close male kin. He had a nephew, Minotaur, but he was through the female line, and regardless, he was also killed during the battle. This is when Prince Arvedui of Arthedain would make his famous claim to the throne of Gondor. He had married Firiel, Ondor's daughter, so his argument was that his descendants would be both descended from Anarion and Isildur. This was rejected, but the claim wasn't forgotten, and it was much of the basis of Aragorn's successful claim over 1,000 years later. Fortunately for the nobility of Gondor, they got lucky this time, because Ondor had died fighting the Wainriders, but the Wainriders, and their Haradrim allies, had been defeated by a man named Eärnil. Eärnil was of the House of Anarion, but he wasn't actually that closely related to Ondor. His great-grandfather, Arcurias, was the younger brother of Narmakil II, Ondor's grandfather. I had to look up a chart to know this, but basically that means that Eärnil was Ondor's second cousin once removed. But to make up for the somewhat distant relationship, Eärnil had a strong claim on the throne on the basis of being a war hero, a victorious general who had saved Gondor when even the king had failed. So the year after, Eärnil was crowned as King Eärnil II with no objections. The succession crisis had been avoided. Fast forward a little over 100 years to the disappearance of Eärnur, Eärnil II's son, Gondor entered yet another succession crisis, and this time, there was no war hero to make it easy. Eärnur, like Ondor, didn't have any close male kin, and although there were descendants of Anarion around, there were two problems. One, some claimants were not of pure enough Númenórean descent, and were thus disqualified. And two, even though some claimants did pass this barrier, they didn't necessarily have a stronger claim than some of their fellow claimants, and as a result, not all would accept them as king. For Gondor's nobility, this was too risky. Raising one of these other claimants to the position of king would potentially start another civil war, and this time, it would surely destroy Gondor. So the Gondorians opted for the safest road, and that was the path of the Stewards. The Stewards themselves were descendants of Anarion, but they had formed a cadet branch called the House of Hurin, named after Hurin of Emyn Arnen, who became steward during the early 17th century. Following Hurin, the stewards were always selected from his descendants, and following Pelender, who was steward during the latter half of the 20th century, the position became hereditary. So the stewards commanded a lot of respect, not just due to their own lineage, but because they had acted as faithful servants of the realm for centuries, and had already guided Gondor through one succession crisis. So hold up, why not then just make the stewards the kings? They were of high Númenórean descent from Anarion himself, and were proven rulers and advisors, and in reality they exercised all the powers of a king. The only differences were that they didn't wear a crown and they didn't sit on the throne. Interestingly enough, this is a question that Boromir asked as a boy. How many hundreds of years needs it to make a steward a king if the king returns not? Denethor would answer, few years maybe in other places of less royalty. In Gondor, 10,000 years would not suffice. The official reason for this is that when each new steward ascended to the, stewardship, they swore an oath, with the specific words, to hold rod and rule in the name of the king, until he shall return. After all, Eärnur was missing, not confirmed dead. But in reality, these words just became part of the ritual rather than actually being sacred, as after all, these stewards were kings in all but name. Perhaps the actual reason was that we're told that many in Gondor believed that a king, not necessarily the king, meaning Eärnur, would one day return. And the reason for this is that some in Gondor still remembered Arvedui's claim, and given that on last report, the northern line still existed in the form of Arvedui's son, Aranarth, it was believed that this king could come from the northern line. We're told that the stewards were aware of this, and were actually afraid of this, which ended up manifesting greatly in Denethor II. So the people of Gondor had long memories, and thus had no desire to raise the stewards up as kings. Any steward attempting to ignore tradition might have run into some trouble, possibly a civil war, as there were other powerful noble houses in the realm, such as the princes of Dol Amroth, who could contest them. And as Gondor waned in strength, a civil war would have been suicide. But to the credit of the stewards, none of them tried this, and although they were perhaps wary of their power being stolen by some vagabond from the north, they mostly ended up being wise and effective leaders. Each steward was also smart enough to leave behind an heir, not necessarily a son. In one case it was a nephew, and another a second cousin, but hey, that's still better than what Eärnur did. And as we know, the king would end up returning, in the form of Aragorn, who would become King Earnur. He had all the proof required to claim the throne of Gondor. He was the heir of both Isildur and Anarion, and he knew his lineage. He had the sword Anduril, the reforged Narsil. He led the Oathbreakers, whom only the heir of Isildur could summon. He led an army to save Minas Tirith. He had the healing hands of a king. And ignoring all the mystical stuff, he was an all-round great man with plenty of experience and a wealth of knowledge. Even if Denethor had stood against him, it probably wouldn't have worked. And Faramir, technically the new ruling steward, was all too happy to give Aragorn his crown. If you want more information on how Aragorn was able to claim the crown, I have a full video on that topic too. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. I think the cool thing about our information about the succession crisis and members of the royal family either renouncing or defecting show that it wasn't exactly smooth sailing in post-Kinstrife Gondor, and that it was probably a fairly cutthroat environment. I think the limited information we receive about these sorts of things make us think that, well, things were simple, when in reality, politics in Gondor might have been quite complex. Cheers, farewell, and remember, if you're really good at football, whatever that means to you, don't call yourself the king of football, call yourself the ruling steward of football.